Let's compare what the media said about climate change, migration and conflict in Syria with what other academics have said. First, let's look at the media narrative. Now, different outlets have described it slightly differently, but what I'm presenting here represents a very common way in which the media have described the flow of events. First, climate change has worsened drought, and specifically it made the drought in the mid-2000s in Syria longer and more severe. There is good scientific evidence for this. This drought then drove people from the countryside into Syria's cities, and again there's good evidence that this was the case. It's also true that this kind of rural to urban migration is frequently the consequence of drought in other parts of the world as well. Now, this is where the media narrative becomes slightly vague. The claim seems to be that the new arrivals in Syria's cities sparked violence. Depending on the news story, there is some suggestion that conflict erupted between migrants and existing residents, and that this conflict erupted over scarce resources. The media repeated this version of events after Prince Charles stated in an interview that he had predicted climate change would create resource conflicts, and that this, he believed, was what was happening in Syria. The media narrative then goes that this initial conflict descended into a protracted civil war. As the violence intensified, people fled Syria. Some elements of this narrative are robust, while others are not. It's certainly the case that climate change has led to more severe drought. It's also the case that all over the world, when drought strikes, it destroys rural livelihoods. And when this happens, people move into cities in search of work to replace the income they lost as a result of the drought. And this does seem to be what happened in Syria. But here is where we depart from the media narrative. Many of the rural people who moved into Syria's cities rightly blamed the Syrian regime for their poverty. Decades of state-level mismanagement and corruption had made them especially vulnerable to drought. Some researchers have argued that people living in rural Syria had reached the point where they were ready and wanted to overthrow the regime before they moved into the cities. In the cities, they found people who were equally ready to rise up against the regime. The new arrivals and existing residents actually cooperated in their initial protests and demonstrations against the regime. The problem here is that in the media narrative, the suggestion is that recently arrived migrants fought with existing residents. The problem with this is firstly that it doesn't seem to be true, but it also suggests that the initial migration resulted in violence and chaos. There is a subtext here. Many people would read into this that migration, or even migrants themselves, are likely to cause violence when they move. There is little evidence for this in general. In fact, it's very difficult to find any evidence for this kind of relationship anywhere in the academic literature. And it certainly wasn't what happened in Syria. As we know, the uprising in Syria against the regime wasn't successful. But the regime's attempt to put down the uprising was not completely successful either. In the regime's attempt to quash the uprising, they dramatically raised the levels of violence, resulting in huge numbers of civilian casualties. The regime never completely regained control of the entire country. Violence between the regime and rebel forces escalated. Large parts of Syria also fell under the control of terrorist organizations. Several other governments also took part in military action in Syria. The violence and chaos forced millions of people to flee Syria as refugees. And this chain of events is largely what is responsible for the refugee situation that we saw in Europe in 2015.